Thank you. I'm just two small areas, and then I'll sit down. FRSSI, as we have talked about, is a way to, it's a tool to manage the stocks, and it reflects the productivity of stocks. And it allows for management by controlling harvest rates, essentially. Is that fair, Mr. Cass?
Yes, the control of harvest rate.
Okay.
Yeah.
But one thing that the FRSSI model doesn't consider, and even the FRSSI process, as far as I understand, doesn't consider, is the effect that habitat has on productivity. Is that correct?
I mean, the population dynamics, there is a parameter in there that it attempts to estimate the capacity, the habitat capacity of a CU, say, in that case. So there are also other approaches that directly attempt to measure the carrying capacity, the habitat capacity for sockeye, based on in-lake assessment of the nutrients that are in the lake to support juvenile salmon. So there's a concept of using what we know about the habitat and build that into the population dynamics. But I think you're going somewhere else.
But the model doesn't look at how habitat could be changed to improve productivity. That's not a factor that goes into the model in any way.
Doesn't look at how habitat could be changed to.
It makes no assumptions about how, if habitat was changed one way or the other, it could improve or make worse productivity of the fish. Is that right? It looks, what you're talking about is more part of the retrospective. It looks at, it's incorporated into the models that are run in FRSSI, right?
Yeah. Now you could, given the right data, you could use information from the habitat or changes in habitat, for example, that could change the way the model is parameterized. So it would use information from the habitat if there's been a change to in the model to compensate for that change. You could do that.
It's not.
But it requires data.
And it's not being done now.
No.
Right, Mr. Morley.
Just to expand on that, I think one of the issues that Mr. Commissioner raised was the sort of relationship between the FRSSI model and the wild salmon policy, and how this is being put forward as a pilot implementation of the wild salmon policy. And I guess I would say that it isn't really in the sense that Dr. Cass answered the question, because the wild salmon policy is supposed to include a significant habitat component in looking at the influences habitat and the availability of habitat and potential alterations in habitat as ways to address a population that might be in the red zone or in a lower status, in addition to harvest management. FRSSI only looks at your only way of controlling the status of population is through harvest management, and so it doesn't look at other ways that you could, either through removing obstacles, improving spawning ground habitat, lake enrichment, whatever you could do to alter the habitat to improve productivity, to boost the population, is not one of the things that are considered within the FRSSI model, and therefore it's not really a full implementation of an example of implementing the wild salmon policy.
Mr. Wilson?
Could you give me the question again, please?
Well, I wish I could kind of come up with a coherent question. I don't think it was very coherent the first time I asked it, but it was really whether habitat impacts are contained within the FRSSI model right now to either look at how productivity could be improved or worsened depending on habitat changes in the future.
Well, I think to some extent, I hate to defend the FRSSI model, but to the extent that productivity changes that are related to habitat damage or loss are reflected in the historical data set, they've had their influence on productivity within the data set, and so the FRSSI model will be assuming that those things have happened.
But it's looking to the past. It's not looking to the future. If improvements were made to habitat that would then influence productivity, those assumptions are not put into the model.
No, we can imagine any kind of future productivity we'd like and have that in the model. And if we imagine that we're going to do something dramatic to not only reduce the loss of habitat and habitat damage, but to actually improve habitat, for example, lake fertilization or some other process, we could speculate that future productivities will be somewhat higher than historical productivities and try to address it in that way. Or if we imagine that ongoing climate change and the loss of tree cover and changes in the hydrograph would all work to the disadvantage of Sockeye, then we could speculate that future productivities would be somewhat lower. So since we don't know what the future brings, it's entirely up to the people that run the model to set those things going forward, and the model will do whatever you ask it to do.
Mr. Staley?
I think habitat's a big word. It plays into the historical data analysis at least in 4 places in the model. One, the so-called productivity parameter. The other is a carrying capacity parameter, both of which are habitat related. There's also a parameter which deals with how variable, innately variable the population is, which has a habitat component to it, as well as the other mortality, other harvesting is related to habitat issues as the adults move upstream. So there are several places in the representation of the population dynamics where habitat plays a role. All of which, as Ken said, could be you could hypothesize changes in and look at how robust the control rules are to those changes. But to my knowledge, that kind of analysis has not been done yet.
Mr. Cass, did you have anything to add, or can I?
No, except
Microphone,
I
please.
certainly agree with Mike. What I was trying to portray is that if there's a change in the habitat and there's a measure of that in terms of data, there are methods now to use that in the same construct as the stock recruitment model is used. As Mike said, there's a productivity parameter and a habitat parameter that can be that then you can add to include habitat, but we haven't done that. I don't recall instances of data being available that shows there's been some change in the habitat that we could account for somehow in the model.
Right, my last question is just a big picture question. We've talked a lot about FRSSI today and heard some criticisms of it in some places where people have think it provides useful information and places where people think it could be improved. Big picture, are the FRSSI escapement targets, as they're presently being developed, useful for managing Fraser River sockeye? Is it a useful tool? And I'll start with you, Mr. Staley.
Yes, I would have to say it's useful. It incorporates, it's probably one of the best approaches to incorporating the historical data that we have available. It uses the best available modern tools to analyze that data. And in that sense, it's very useful. It provides some guidance, whether people like that guidance or not, at the beginning of the season.
Mr. Morley?
I think it has been useful. It is developing, and it needs to continue to develop to make some of the improvements that I was talking about previously. I do think that it, as with a lot of our IFMP rules that are developed, it tends to be somewhat inflexible in season and needs to have a built-in mechanism to sort of make changes to the goalposts in season based on an in-season evaluation framework, because we have had a number of instances where those inflexible rules put you in perverse situations during the year. So, but it has certainly been it's been a good process, and it needs to continue to improve.
Mr. Wilson?
Well, yes, clearly the TAM rules are useful because we use them. That's how we set up our preseason plan. To me, though, the question is whether or not the guidance that the FRSSI process is providing in the form of the TAM rules is reasonably impartial and unbiased. So I have a number of reservations about the way these models are built and the kinds of information they use and the kinds of information they don't use that lead me to question whether the outcome, the long-term outcome from applying these TAM rules is what we think it is. For example, when it comes to weak stocks, one of the things we do is try to understand the probability of extinction of these weak stocks by measuring the frequency with which they drop down below a particular benchmark for escapement. It may, however, turn out that if our assumptions around productivity are incorrect, we may dramatically underestimate the likelihood of extinction from some of these stocks, particularly if we see dramatic change in the future that was unanticipated in the use of the model. So yes, they're useful, but they're also somewhat dangerous.
Mr. Cass, I'll leave the last word to you.
Well, I'm not a user. I was involved in the technical level of the development of the tool. But I would have to say it's only as good as the, how good it is to take account preferences of those who are affected by it. And the only way, it seems like, at least our experience over the last 8 years or so, are the only way that we have been able to really see if we're making progress or taking steps back is to learn from one season to the next, I guess, and build on what we have as the way forward. We came from a time when we originally just take the trying to assess how we would model future changes in productivity, and and again, I think Mike said it best. It's difficult, if not impossible, to predict the future, and that's sort of a joke. And so you look for strategies or TAM rules that are, as best they can, be robust and to whatever scenarios you think are important for the future. They're wrestling with different sectors' view of the world and their value on the components of the model, and the ability to communicate is I think where the challenges lie here.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are the questions I have. The council who follow me will be Mr. Taylor for Canada, followed by Mr. Leadham for the Conservation Coalition.
Mitchell Taylor for the participant Government of Canada, Mr. Commissioner, and with me is Hugh McCauley. I have a number of questions for the panel. Just to let you know at the outset, I don't anticipate finishing my examination this afternoon. I understand that this panel is available and coming back tomorrow morning. I'm going to ask this question of the panel, and I'll start with Mr. Cass, in part because Ms. Baker asked this of you in the first go, but then I'm going to ask the other panel members about this as well. Towards the end of Ms. Baker's questioning, she asked you, Mr. Cass, whether FRSSI was all about managing by controlling the harvest rate, and you seemed to pause in giving an answer and then said something to the effect, I guess so, or something like that. And it may be a case of how one approaches this, or by analogy, the glass half full, glass half empty. It all depends on your approach and attitude, but at the end of the day, the glass is the same. However you characterize it being with half the total volume of water in it. Is the focus of FRSSI really aimed at fixing escapement levels or targets as distinct from controlling the harvest? Which is the overriding or most important aspect, if you like? Fixing escapement targets or dealing with the harvest management? One flows from the other, of course, but which is the emphasis or the predominant of predominant importance, or does it all depend on one's view?
I guess I would start, Mr. Commissioner, with it depends where the run size is relative to the TAM rule. At low stock sizes where there's the TAM rule declines at some point, then and reverts to a fixed escapement policy, then at that stage it's designed to, or that level of run size is designed to provide the same number of fish with a declining harvest rate over that period. However, above that trigger point where there is the fixed exploitation strategy, then the purpose, Mr. Commissioner, is to divide in some way what 60-40 rule or whatever it turns out to be, and taking into account the environmental conditions during migration. Then it's a harvest rate managed system where the equal proportions go to both harvest and to escapement. So, and that's in the traditional sense a fixed harvest or exploitation rate strategy, notwithstanding the environmental, the TAM part of the rule. Workshop that we had that looked at cyclic dominance it's a fixed, in one sense, it's a fixed exploitation rate strategy with this contingency down at the lower end to solve some of the conservation problems and ensure that there's adequate escapement for future propagation. So in what I'm trying to say is there's two, depending on where you are in run size, there's two different views of of what that TAM rule is designed to do.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. Would it be correct that the fundamental point at the end of the day is to get an appropriate number of spawners on the spawning grounds?
That is the overriding priority of conservation, and it is a key to sustained populations in the future. That is the number one factor that you're trying to ensure.
Other panel members, do you have a comment on this? That is, what FRSSI is all about? Is it at one or both of escapement or harvest control? Mr. Staley, do you want to go first or go next?
I'd say that at the basis of it, it's about assessing performance, where performance has elements of catch, has elements of escapement, has elements about the variability in catch and escapement, and perhaps other things. And it's the assessing of the performance with regards to the harvest management, I think. That would be my, in terms of the structure of the model and the inputs and outputs that are set there. We are measuring, the model measures performance of various aspects, and so that's what the model is trying to do. The model is given a control, which is on the harvest component of the mortality. So I'd have to say that those are the focuses. Clearly, escapement is important, and but it's one of many performance measures. And FRSSI was intended to try and assist in when conservation, I guess, where conservation would mean that there aren't, there's some danger of or some inability to sustain itself. Populations find themselves in inability to sustain themselves. Not just those kinds of situations, but situations where there's abundance of fish and how much of that abundance should be taken now and how much should be put in the bank for future production.
Mr. Morley?
Mr. Commissioner, I would say this is a chicken and egg question, and we're actually interested in both the chickens and the eggs. So really, it's not just it's easy for people to say, well, conservation is the number one objective, and therefore we're really trying to get spawners to the spawning grounds. But as I indicated in my first session in front of you here, is that my view of conservation is broader than that, and it includes long-term sustainable use, and certainly we're interested in sustaining the productivity of the resource and looking at what mix of benefits it can generate over the longer term. So that's what FRSSI is attempting to assess, as Mr. Staley said.
All right, thank you. Now, I'll ask this of Mr. Cass, I think, and I'm picking up on a question that the Commissioner asked earlier this morning, where he asked about, as I recall, exploitation rate, harvest rate, TAM and TAC, and whether they're all the same or different, and you explained some of the differences at that time, Mr. Cass. I'm going to try this again by putting some numbers into it to see if we can add some more clarity to this than what already exists. If you have a forecast run size of 2 million fish, and you identify that the escapement that you should have is 800,000, it follows, does it, that the exploitation number would be 1.2 million? Is that right?
The harvest from 2 million, was it the first number?
2 million
Escapement.
fish, 800,000
Yeah.
escapement, so the total exploitation, sorry, the TAM rather. The TAM, I guess, is what I'm...
1.2, is that what it?
Well, that's the TAM, isn't it? The total allowable mortality?
The TAM, yeah. But the 1.2, if you have a 0.1 or 800,000 escapement, is that what the number you're reading?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you take that from the total run, you get 1.2. 1.2 is then what's left over as the TAM, correct?
So that's the total allowable mortality.
Yeah.
And then the TAC would be a smaller number than 1.2. It would be the TAM minus the management adjustments, would it?
Yes.
And put another way, the harvest rate is whatever number plus management adjustment, which equals your TAM.
Yes.
Mr. Morley earlier this morning, when one talked about a TAM of 60%, you then spoke of the actual harvest being less than 60%, sometimes being 30 or 50%, and that's what you're referring to, was it, Mr. Morley?
No, that was, I wasn't talking about the management adjustment in that context. I was talking about the overlap between different run timing groups. So if you had an early summer TAM that conflicted with a summer TAM, you may end up going to the lowest common denominator, and so you would not necessarily be harvesting at the TAM rule that might be higher for the stock, the stronger stock, or the stock that was at a different level of MA.
Okay. Mr. Staley, you appeared to be nodding as though you had something to say. Did you want to add anything? All right. Mr. Commissioner, have I added any clarity or added confusion in putting numbers into it?
I'd rather not say, Mr. Taylor.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Mr. Cass, am I correct that in order to identify what the escapement should be, there's a suite of tools that are used, and that includes the pre-season forecast and the test fishing, the hydroacoustics, and some of the other aspects that come into stock assessment, which we've heard about in evidence over the last 10 days or so. And you take the information from all of that, and that is going to give you what you're looking at in terms of a run size, and then the ability to put to develop your escapement target.
So just walking through it, Mr. Commissioner, the run size for the preseason run size forecast informs the preseason planning process. What are the plausible scenarios to consider in developing a plan? And so then that becomes, I guess, a benchmark by which you can then develop a plan around that. But realizing, of course, that the preseason forecast is just that, with a lot of uncertainty, which has already been presented here. But the other tools that you described, for example, the hydroacoustics or the other tools for estimating run size, is a way in season to understand what the run size is, and then from that is derived the target escapement. So the TAM rule then would be applied to the run size that would be based on whatever methods are available, test fisheries in season, hydroacoustics in season. And so the TAM rule would be applied to those estimates of run sizes based on those tools, those assessment tools.
All right, thank you. Now I'd like to ask about the 60% ceiling that has been talked about already, and how you got to that point. I'll start with you, Mr. Cass. Can you explain how the department reached 60%, both in terms of who did you get input from and what factors or criteria, with and apart from input from any number of people you had, what factors went into coming up with 60%? How did you get there?
Well, I could tell you, as I think it's already been said, the choice of 60% TAM roll was a policy choice, but with some background in understanding what the underlying uncertainty was in estimating what the optimal exploitation rate, or TAM, would be. That's kind of the, there's the background of data. There's the understanding that not all the data is, there's not all the CUs are not included from which you derive the estimates of optimal escapement. So the 60%, the thinking around the choice of 60% is that it is on the low end for most of the stocks that we consider in the 19 stocks, say, that we consider in our estimates of productivity, and therefore the optimal exploitation rate. But to guard against the possibility that there are unmonitored stocks with limited or no data that have a low productivity, the numbers that were considered were thought to be more precautionary by going on the low side of the distribution of exploitation rate. Again, to guard against stocks that aren't represented, and as well implementation error in the estimates of run size in season, as well as the ability to actually effect a perfect harvest rate. But now you asked about the process and who's involved and how did we get to that decision. It's a little vague to me how that was aired out or discussed within the stakeholder workshop process. And I'm not certain exactly to what level there was discussion about what are the alternatives other than 60%. But I do know that eventually it was a policy decision to hedge against uncertainty.
All right, and in the course of questioning, I think that Mr. Morley and Mr. Wilson, who I believe were at some of these workshops, may shed some light on that, and we'll come to that. Mr. Staley may have been there, I'm not sure. In terms of the 60% figure, if you could identify one stock and fish one stock, and that one stock was a healthy stock, is there a rule of thumb as to what the optimal harvest rate is if you're fishing one healthy stock? What percentage is what I'm getting at? Mr. Staley, or Mr. Wilson, do you have a view? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Well, there's no single rule of thumb, because different numbers of fish will return each year, even from a healthy stock.
All right.
So if you're trying to put a specific number of fish on the spawning grounds, then the number that you can harvest will vary by year. So will that be a constant percentage? No, because productivity changes over time. And so the number of offspring produced by each spawner will vary. So there really isn't a rule of thumb, unless you want to consider the stock recruit curves that we develop that try to describe the general relationship between the number of spawners and the number of subsequent offspring, would be a rule of thumb.
Is 65 to 70% harvest on a healthy stock, if you could identify that one stock that you're harvesting, been used in the fish management world?
I don't know of very many places where fixed exploitation rates are applied regardless of the number of fish returning.
All right. Do Mr. Morley or Mr. Staley want to add anything to that?
I'm trying to recall I could do some. I haven't done recent research on that. I recall a discussion with some of the academics that I worked with who referred a paper, which I haven't, which I apologize, I was meaning to dig out before today. But the discussion, at least, was that they had read a paper so it's like all secondhand, that had had attempted to fit a stock and recruitment relationship, or Ricker relationship, to as many Sockeye stocks up and down the Pacific coast as they could, and sort of provide a sort of an average, sort of the average healthy Sockeye stock on the Pacific coast. And if that were to be managed, that's one of the points in on the spectrum of abundance for any particular stock, is the point at which maximum sustainable yield, if the world was if equilibrium existed and the world behaved as in some hypothetical way, and at that point your sort of sustainable harvest rate, if my recollection is correct, is in the 60 to 70% range. That most, if you do look at the stock recruitment curves that you get for most healthy stocks, the 60-70% range is where you would find theoretically the MSY level.
All right, thank you. That's helpful.
I'd just like to add to that is that it's, again, I think it does vary according to the productivity regime you're in, and I'd certainly, if you look, for example, at Bristol Bay, with which I have some experience since we've got operations. Our company's had operations up there for a couple of decades, and it is. We're seeing a situation up there right now where they're probably harvesting more in the 80 to 90% range on a sustainable basis over a long period of time with healthy sockeye populations. During the time period when the IPSFC was managing the Fraser sockeye fishery, we did see building populations on a slow long-term growth curve over a long period of time, when they were harvesting at in excess of 75%. On many populations, those were the strong ones, and they were harvesting some of the non-peak cycle years at a higher rate than that even. So it depending on the productivity regime and the situation you're in, it can be sustainable at much higher levels.
Now, the Bristol Bay situation that you refer to is up in Alaska, correct?
That's correct.
And that's a different situation than the Fraser, isn't it? There's not nearly the length of migration or river system up there as compared to the Fraser, is there?
None of the individual river systems are as large as the Fraser, but there's about six major systems there, and each of them does have a number of different stocks in it. Certainly the fishery is somewhat different, and it's managed somewhat different than what we manage here.
Is it the case that the geography is such up there that you're able to get a handle on what you're dealing with in terms of the stocks sooner than you can in the Fraser system?
I wouldn't agree with that.
Right.
I think that again, it goes back certain to time periods, and there was a time period when Bristol Bay populations were not as productive as they are today, and where harvest rates were lower and the overall production was lower. And certainly we've seen a time period in the Fraser River where productivity was higher than the current situation. So it's I think those are, if you have to look at the number of returns per spawner, and if you look over the 50-year time series we have on the Fraser, you can see the number of returns per spawner in any given year varying from less than 1 to 1, which we've seen on a couple of occasions. Very difficult, 2009 being one of them. But other times when we've had returns per spawner for some of the populations that have in excess of 25 to 1. So it's highly variable, and what a sustainable harvest rate is depends on the long-term regime. So 60%, I'd say, would be very conservative in terms of sustainable for healthy sockeye populations.
Now, Mr. Cass, are you familiar with the Ricker and Larkin models, both of which have been referred to today and other days in evidence?
Yes, I am.
Do each of them play a role in the FRSSI modeling?
Yes, they do. And again, following the 2006 workshop, cyclic dominance workshop that we had here, there was a recommendation to adopt the Larkin model in order to deal with the delay density impacts that were being estimated by that model.
Can you explain for the commissioner firstly, before I ask this question, which I'll have the word, I'll be wanting you to briefly describe it, but I just noted the hour, Mr. Commissioner. Do you want me to take another 5 or 7 minutes? Okay. Can you briefly describe for the commissioner what is the Ricker model and what is the Larkin model and what is the difference between those two? These are models that we've heard about, and they underpin some of the modeling that is being considered in this evidence and elsewhere, and so it's important to understand what they are.
Well, a Ricker model, Mr. Commissioner, is a statistical model that looks at the, as you may have heard, looks at the relationship between the number of spawners that contribute to future progeny. And so if you look at the relationship between the number of spawners in a given year over a range of years and the subsequent recruitment or progeny that are produced, there's a relationship that describes the productivity of that particular population, as well as the capacity limits of that particular relationship. So it's formulated in terms of 2 parameters, really. Mike said it is 3, which describes the innate variability in the data points, the individual spawner data point and the recruit data point over time. But the Ricker model is really, and then there's the third parameter, if you like. So there's a productivity parameter, a capacity parameter, and a parameter that provides an index of the variability of the data around that relationship that's described by the Ricker model. And so that's the fundamental model. Now there are, of course, one of the interests in fisheries science is to, and one of the issues in terms of how you take a model and estimates of parameters is how you deal with the uncertainty in terms of the precision of the, say in this case, the productivity parameter and the capacity parameter is how do you take account the uncertainty in those parameters. And interestingly, for the Ricker model, what is reasonably well determined is the productivity parameter, which is the productivity at low stock sizes. So the productivity parameter is determined with much more confidence than the capacity parameter. And the capacity parameter is the measure of, what's the number of fish, what's the optimal, use that word again, the optimal number of fish to meet a certain objective, whether it's to fully seed the habitat with juveniles or whether it's to seed sufficiently to have the highest surplus yield. So it's really a 3-parameter model that statistically compares the number of spawners over time with the progeny that it's produced. So that's the Ricker model. The Larkin model is a Ricker model, but with added terms, we call them lag terms, that describe the degree of delay density that each of the preceding, in the way it's formulated in FRSSI, each of the preceding spawning years from the current year. So, for example, in 2010, there are a number of spawners observed on the spawning ground. If you use that spawner in a Ricker model, which doesn't have these have the ability to assess the degree of interaction or the delay density, then you just simply project that spawning abundance forward in time a generation to come up with the progeny that are produced. The Larkin model, on the other hand, takes into account the 3 preceding years, at least the way it is formulated here, to test the assumption that there is a delay density effect. Very large dominant years can affect the subsequent years by resulting in a large food resource. There are a number of hypotheses about this. Results in a large food resource for predators such as rainbow trout in a lake that then become conditioned and themselves become Their dynamics is influenced by their mortality. Their survival is increased by the fact that they have a lot of food to munch on because you have had a strong year class come through. But that very healthy rainbow trout population, to use the example, then is able to live long enough to munch on the next 3 years to come along, next year's results of spawning to come along. So that's the notion of delayed density, that there's some, it doesn't have to be predation, it could be some predator, or sorry, some disease or parasite factor that's influenced by the population dynamics of sockeye or food availability. So the Larkin model is, again, a statistical model with added terms to test how important the delay density effects of preceding year classes are on future production.
So is it the case that the Larkin model takes account of cyclic dominance, whereas the Ricker model does not?
Now, that depends on what you're assuming to be the cause of cycles, because you can have cycles in a Ricker model situation with very high harvest rates, and given the 4-year age structure of the populations, so you can set up in the way that you harvest, given the age structure of the population, you can set up cycles in a population, but that doesn't mean that there is the kind of delay density effects that are biologically driven or assumed to be biologically driven by the Larkin model. So the Larkin model will, under many cases of harvest, or many ranges of harvest, will generate cycles because of the delay density effect, the interaction between the cycles.
I think you've alluded to this, but is it the case that in 2006 that the Larkin model was added into the FRSSI modeling?
Yeah, it had been considered previously in not just the FRSSI process that started, say, in 2002, but it was also considered in the so-called 87 rebuilding plan as an alternative model. But in the FRSSI process, it gained significant ground following that workshop, which there was some consensus there that we should be using the Larkin model to account for the assumed hypothesis that biological explanation for cycles.
All right, and the workshop you're referring to is the 2006 one?
Correct.
Mr. Wilson, is there anything you want to say about Ricker and Larkin?
I guess the fundamental issue with the use of the Larkin model is that it allows us to model situations in which cyclic dominance appears to occur, but it doesn't really enlighten us very much about why there's cyclic dominance, when and how it might break down or reestablish, or any of the other important factors that might lead you to accept one particular kind of harvest policy over another. So it's descriptive, right? It fits historical data, but because we don't understand the mechanism, it's somewhat hard to understand how cyclic dominance will change going forward under particular harvest regimes.
All right, Mr. Staley, in terms of what is the Ricker model and the Larkin model, did you want to add anything?
Just that the formulation of the Ricker model is a special case of the Larkin model with no cycle interactions. That's another way, and that's the reason it was chosen out of that workshop. My recollection of the workshop was that it embraced both alternative views of the world, that there were cycles that were there because of the interaction behavior between cycle lines, and there were cycles there that were for which there were perhaps no interaction. So the Larkin model the Ricker model is a special case of the Larkin model, so we didn't need the Ricker model. We just used the Larkin model with zero interaction terms.
All right. And Mr. Morley, am I right that by reason of your background you would not be considered or feeling qualified to speak to the models, or are you?
I don't feel a need to speak to the models.
Thank you. All right. And Mr. Commissioner, this is an appropriate time to break.
Mr. Commissioner, we'll begin tomorrow with David Patterson on management adjustments at 9 o'clock. That's correct.
Thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned until 9 o'clock in the morning, and the elevators will not be open until 8:30.